No. So, hi. So glad to be here. I am Dr. Carla Engelbrecht, and I am here with Dr. Marcie Beigel, and we are here to talk about elections with kids. Because if you are in the US, or quite frankly, a lot of places around the world, there's a lot of noise about the US elections that are happening tomorrow. We want to have share our framework for how to talk elections with kids in a nonpartisan, very practical way. So this is not a political discussion. This is actually for us to help you, because my world, so as somebody who has spent years creating media and entertainment and educational products for kids and families, I think a lot about how do we help our kids learn about the media they're consuming to operate in the world they live in? How do we help them learn digital literacy and learn about civics in the process? So that's the lens I bring. How about you, Dr. Marcie?
Well, and I have spent years working with families to build more harmony and more happiness, to get the fighting and the yelling out of it. And this election seems like a great opportunity to practice some of those harmonizing skills, to practice some of those critical conversation skills. It is another opportunity to use that lens. And I think because of the uniqueness of what an election is, and especially this election cycle, that remembering that those tools that we use to get our kids to sit and eat dinner or to get their homework done might actually apply here is unique and helpful to anyone with kids who are trying to navigate this week and what's coming in the months ahead.
Indeed. Yeah. So we're already getting into the meat of like, why are these conversations worth happening? And it's really because elections are everywhere right now. There are lawn signs, there are TV ads, there are conversations overheard in the grocery store. There are conversations happening on the playground where kids are repeating what they hear from their parents. And so even if you are in a home where you are limiting media exposure, our kids are exposed to election conversations and they're absorbing that information about the world around them. And generally, parents want to help their kids make sense of what they're seeing and hearing. We think a lot about how do we keep those conversations age appropriate and nonpartisan so that we're developing their understanding of civics, of digital literacy, of critical thinking, of emotional intelligence, all of these kinds of things.
And I love that. And I think it's so important that parents are the ones facilitating that conversation. I want your kids to hear from you about this election. What is your family's views and values and ideas so that your kids are being shaped by the family that they're being raised in, as opposed to all of these other voices in the world, which is part of why we are going to do our best. We're humans too, but do our best to make it about how to have these conversations, not the exact conversation itself. So use real world examples when you're talking to your kids of, how do we have this conversation with kindness? How do we talk about the different candidates and their different opinions and the different pieces of the election that are going on with empathy for people who have a different opinion or a different experience? Because those skills you want your kids to have. And this is not a moment to be like, yeah, I want you to be kind, but it doesn't work that way. If you're trying to teach your kids how to be kind and speak respectfully, then make sure that is included in this conversation as well. We also want you to model how to have a critical conversation. It's not always easy for us to talk about this. It's not always easy for us to know the right words or put our emotions aside to think clearly about something. And this is a moment to talk to your kids about this. Whether you're having big feelings or little feelings, naming that for your child and then saying it's an important conversation. And that's why we're going to talk about it. And as Dr. Carla, as you said, which I love, being age appropriate. Your 3-year-old is going to be a much shorter conversation than your 13-year-old. And talking about why that is with them. We're just going to have a little conversation about this because their attention span is little, but we want to make sure you know what's happening. It's a great way to start them understanding these important pieces of their life and your family's life. So you ready to get started, Dr. Carla?
Let's do it. So if Dr. Marcie and I talk before, we share a 5-step framework of how to have these kinds of conversations. It's everything from processing frustration because, something you're losing a game, right? From very little moments through to we use it for very big moments too, like when kids see something inappropriate online or experiencing cyberbullying. So this framework is very flexible and we're going to walk you through it. It's 5 steps. And so as we get started, that first step is to breathe. This is for you as the parent, because if you are not calm and collected, you do your kids no good. And one of the key parts when you start to think about elections is making sure that you're processing your own political views and feelings first, separate from your child, unless you want to pass along whatever processing you're doing and then go for it. But I'm guessing most of you are in that place, right? Go have your strong opinions elsewhere, your reactions, if you need to curse or anything, like let that go outside of with your kids.
I love that you're like, let your cursing be outside of your kids, right? Because that's certainly not language we want them to do. But I also know from the conversations that I've been having with parents over the past several weeks, this is not always an easy thing to do. And anywhere we're using this critical conversation lens, it's not always easy to do, but it's important that you decide to have these conversations at a moment where you can be regulated. So if your child says something that is the other side of the street from you, you can take a breath and be like, well, that's interesting, but have the space to respond. Because you getting in conflict with your child is what we really want to avoid. We want you to be able to find a way to agree to disagree. And you being measured, you taking that deep breath beforehand is going to be so helpful. So know your biases, know your triggers, know what your child may be repeating from something they heard on the news that is going to push your button rather than being something they truly believe is going to be a really helpful exercise as you walk into this conversation. Because especially if you have a teenager, they might say it just to push your buttons, not because they believe it. And we want you to be able to respond to them from that measured place of how to have this conversation, as opposed to start a fight with your child because they were pushing your buttons, as opposed to it being something that they really believe about. And the final piece of this first step is really consider, what are your family values? What are your family values that you want to embody in this conversation, right? Kindness and empathy, we talked a little bit about before, but also what are your values about democracy? Because for many of us, we don't actually know what they are until we have to sit down and talk about it. And so take a few moments and really think about what do you want to share with your kids that is important to you about this election and about elections in general, because sometimes we're just following the conversation and the information we're receiving and haven't been discerning. We want you to be discerning so you can be intentional and help your kids grow in this conversation. Take some work, but then we get there. And so once you take your deep breath, once you've processed all this, once you've gotten ready, and let's be clear, this is going to be a moment-to-moment change. You might be like, okay, this afternoon, I'm ready. And an hour later, when your kids actually get home from school, you might have taken in additional information and be in a different state where you're like, oh, wait, not the moment to have this conversation. Maybe after dinner, I'll be ready again. So this is not a state that you stay in. It's in flux. But before you start the conversation, this is where you want to be. So then what do we do, Dr. Carla?
Yeah, so then we need to gather information. And this can look like a lot of different things. So one is figuring out what your kids already know. And you can ask them very open-ended, simple questions. The key here is not to assume you know everything about what they're already thinking and exposed to and what they're like having questions about. So finding out what they know, just asking, if you happen to pass a lawn sign or an ad happens to come up and be like, hey, like, what do you think of the election? Or what have you hearing? What are the kids talking about? Find out what they're hearing from friends. They may be teaching civics in school. And so what are they hearing there? What have they heard from election ads? What have they heard from friends? Any of those things are really helpful information to get. And it can also start to clue you in on what kind of questions your child might actually have about what's going on. Even if they don't necessarily know how to voice the questions, they may be starting to put things together in a way that may need some more connective tissue to make it actually make sense.
I love that.
That exact situation myself, where it's like you're saying this and that makes no sense.
The connective tissue, I think, is really important to make sure that you're finding out, well, does that actually mean what you think it means? And do these pieces actually fit together? And I think even in conversations with adults, I've had conversations where that's not how that works. And as our kids are learning about our government and civics and democracy and elections, we want to make sure they understand, how do the pieces work? Which may take some research on our own part. I have to tell you, I've done a bit of research this election season because there were things being asked that I was like, I don't have that answer. Let's figure it out, which is a great way to do the next steps. So you don't have to have all the answers at this point. It's about gathering the information. And the big thing that I think about is make sure it's age appropriate. So you may have a lot of things to say, but your 3-year-old can't digest all of that, or your 7-year-old can't digest all of that, or your 13-year-old can't digest all of that. So how much information can your child take in at a time? And what are the things that they're going to be able to understand and process about either a specific issue or the elections at all? Getting into some of the minutia and the details may be too complicated and turn them off to the conversation, rather than bringing them in and helping them understand what's going on. So you just want to make sure that your lens is adjusted to the age of your child. And if you need help with that, please, we have our contact information at the end. Please feel free to reach out, because the age of your child is not just a biological age. So we can't just give you a, like, here's what you should do at each age. Where you live, the maturity of your child, their language, there are all these different pieces that go into that equation. So we're happy to help you figure out kind of where that roundly is for your child if you give us information. But we don't want to give generalities, because this conversation is about your family. Truth is, you probably know what's appropriate for your child better than we ever do. So we got some information. Now we have to figure out their physical and mental health, which is something that we always recommend doing, because we want to make sure that they are in a place where they can receive the information. And it also determines the urgency with which we have the conversations.
And this one is interesting, because depending on the situation, if you think about, we were talking about this as a sort of framework that applies in many situations, sometimes the severity of this is going to be much higher than other cases. But really it's about thinking about, are they showing signs of either positive or negative signals of their willingness or their need to have support around this? So, it's easy to look for the more negative signals, but there's positive ones as well. Are they showing anxiety about differing opinions? So as they start to hear different things from different people, is that stressing them out? And you might see this in their everyday life, that you may already know this about them, that when there's conflict, it's stressful. Are they having confusion about political concepts, to what we were just talking about? Do they need more explanation beyond just hey, there's an election to decide who's, going to run the country? Do they need to understand more about that? And related to that, are they repeating misinformation or have partial information that is going to require more conversations to help fill in those gaps?
Yeah. One of the ways that misinformation can sometimes show up is conflict with friends, right? So it might be because their friends know something, they know something else, they're making it up in the process, but also you may be hearing more fights with the same friend. It's not having anything to do with the election or politics. It's about a soccer game during recess, but you know that there's different political opinions with that family from yours. So it may be, if you're seeing more conflict, that may be a sign that pieces of the election are challenging for your kiddo and their friends, and you want to support them in how to be a good friend, even if we have different opinions. For some people, that can be challenging in many different scenarios, especially with this election right now, but that's a skill that I think will save your child so much heartache throughout their life. How do we find ways to agree to disagree and move through conflict? You might notice their interest in civic engagements. They may be really excited to talk about this election. They may want to watch the news with you, or they might have no interest. And really what you're looking for in that is a change in their engagement from where they normally are. If your kiddo always wants to know about current events, this might be no different. If your kiddo always avoids the news, this may be no different. But if you notice a change in that, that's what we're looking for as far as a key that they need more information and support in their mental health realm. And then finally, look for signs that they're ready to learn more. If they're asking questions, that's a sign that they're ready to learn more. That's very obvious. but they might just be lingering in the room when you and another grown-up are having conversations about it, or they might just, pause a little longer when they see something in particular. And so notice the subtle signs that are coming through from your kiddo that they want help and support, because our kids don't always know how to ask about how to get help and how to get information. They don't know that they either can ask or they don't know what to ask, because they might assume that if you're not talking to them, they're not supposed to ask. It happens a lot with kids in a wide range of scenarios, but especially here. And if you're someone who has been having big feelings about this, they may not want to kind of open that door, even though they're really curious and need to. So just make sure you're keeping an eye on how they're navigating in some subtle ways.
I've even seen around this and heard from a number of parents, because there's so many lawn signs and ads and everything, that they'll just notice a kid's attention lingering and kind of lingering on a sign, or when the ads come on, that they kind of like pay more attention to it than they would normally something else. So that can even be just that, to your point, a signal of like, oh, I want to learn more about this.
Yeah. And if you're sitting, I know, Dr. Carla, you're a big fan of like sitting and watching with your kids' social media. And if you're noticing that they're scrolling at one speed for certain content and a different speed for political content, that gives you information, right?
Yeah.
So I love that recommendation in general, and we'll throw it in wherever I can. But especially
they go back to it or they slow down. And I think the nice thing is, all of the information you've gathered in step 2, including watching what your kid is doing, and all of this information that you're gathering in step 3 is then what comes together for you to create an action plan. And again, this can take a couple of different, it can be very like, it just happens and it's pretty like, it flows, or there might be points where you stop and pause and you think about like, oh, I got to go find out these things. So, your goal is to be able to, you can choose when and how you're going to discuss it to the extent that the situation allows, share age appropriate definitions. And one of the things you can always do in this case, especially if your kid is not in like active stress, big emotions, is you can say, hey, I would love to talk about this more. I'm driving the car right now, or we're, I'm cooking dinner. I can't give you my full attention, or I need to go look up some more information so I can have this conversation properly with you too. Modeling for them, like, this is important. And so I'm going to give it the attention it deserves. And I want you to have the attention you deserve, is a really key thing to be able to navigate when and how you have these discussions.
I also think the reminder of having multiple small conversations can sometimes be more powerful than one big conversation. And we as adults, we can talk and talk and talk and talk, but sometimes our kids need like a 5-minute conversation. And having many of them, 1 a day, 2 a day, depending on the rhythm of your family, every other day, can go so far, because they can only take in so much at a time.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Going and voting together. I was actually talking to a friend today who was like, I thought about voting ahead of time and going last week, but I really wanted to take my kids on election day. They've never been able to come and be with me and see the process. And she was so excited for them to see what it's like to go vote, because it's a big deal to be able to do that. And so go take your kids with you to vote. Talk to them about what's going on. Talk to them about, waiting in line for it, which we're not always good at doing. We're not good at waiting in lines for most things, but so many people are finding it important to stand in line for voting. So talk to them about that. You can discuss the ads while online, right? While you're standing there waiting to vote, what are the ads saying? Talking to them together. You can also do that at home. What are the ads really saying? Why are they saying that? How is that messaging coming across? How does it make you feel when you hear the different ways they're talking about it? What's actually the issue they're getting at? All those are really important for them to understand how communication happens, as well as who the candidates are. And you can participate in campaigns to help them understand kind of democracy in everyday life. What are the bigger steps that we can take to do in the world to not just vote as an action that's part of our ability to engage in civics, but what else can you do, right? And some of these things, because we're right at election week, are past the moment, but what can we do in the future? There will be more elections. There are local elections. How does this play into all of the things, I can remember as a kid there being, the school votes and how important it was of like, who is the student body president? And you can connect this election to those things that your kids have experienced themselves, whether they felt good or whether they felt like, we see a lot in the movies, it's a popularity contest, right? How does that relate to what's happening here? Because they're both elections, and that's really important. And the final piece of the action plan is just for you to remember you don't need to tell them every single thing you think. They don't need to understand all of the complexities with which you are engaging, all of the complexities that are happening, especially with this election. You need to tell them the things for them to understand, be able to process, and get behind an election in this country. What is that really about? How do the moving pieces work as opposed to every nuanced detail? Dr. Carla, do you have anything to add to the action plan pieces?
Yeah, I think the fostering the critical conversations, right? Conversation is what eventually leads to critical thinking, and especially when you're asking questions. And so this is such a beautiful moment to be able to watch ads together. And ads can be super stressful, and like none of us want to watch ads, honestly, most of the time. But to find an opportunity to actually connect around ads and use it as an opportunity to talk and help foster that critical thinking is a really nice thing when like sometimes you don't have a choice but for the ads to show up. And it can also lead to some really great conversations around values and kindness. And, there's a very contentious election where I live. And so we are seeing ads where they are just sniping at each other. And it creates conversations even about, looking not just at the individual ad, but at the arc of the election and the conversations as a whole. And so that's I think that's something you can get into with this. And it also actually gets into how we think about the fifth step, which is this notion of check-ins and the maintenance plan and the ongoing conversations, because this is not just a single moment in time that you're like, talked about the elections, poof, done. You are like hereby graduated from political election knowledge school, right? It doesn't happen that way. So the maintenance plan or the check-ins is so often forgotten or kind of hand waved as like, yeah, I'll check in. And I think, Dr. Marcie, you especially have been so great about really reinforcing, like, put it on the calendar, make this a habit that you continue to check in with them and be like, hey, you got more questions? What are you hearing? Like, what's going on? Or it could be that you go and you do some sort of civic engagement together. As you were talking about, it's not like this is all over tomorrow. Yeah. Politics continues, the government continues. There's all sorts of really interesting ways to get involved. And so given these conversations, what you've learned about your child's interest, you can start to tailor activities that you do together that allows you to continue fostering this learning, this understanding, all of those different pieces.
Yeah. And it makes me think of point number 3 of monitoring their understanding and questioning, right? If you keep doing things, if you keep talking to them, it helps you understand what they are understanding and also what they're not understanding. And I think especially for me around the presidential election, where the election is now, but the change doesn't happen until for a few months, right? It's like it's 2025 when we get the new president, even though it's decided now, and kind of what happens in between there, what information is going to come out, how is that going to evolve? I think a lot of us have so many questions around that. And so making sure that you're taking your kids with you on that journey as that evolves. And kind of, I went to college in DC, so I can think about the inaugural balls that happen in January, right? Like they were so fun. And so talking to your kids about some of those pieces that are universal and delightful can also add a different flavor to the conversation, but helps them understand this bigger process than this one day of voting. Right. And then keep your eye on their exposure to political content. I know, Dr. Carla, you're a big fan of being aware of when the TV's on and when it's off and who you're following on social media. And are you just in the general feed and what comes in? So I'm hoping you'll share a little bit more about that in a minute. But what's the discussion at school? What's the discussion with friends? I think especially about the day after we find out the results of what is the expectation of how to be kind to anyone in your school that day, of whether they're agreeing, whether the candidate that you're excited about won or didn't win. How do you have that that kind conversation, that supportive conversation with friends at school who may or may not have the same feelings as you. And then what are your family dynamics? We know, especially with this election, there are a lot of complex, let's say, family dynamics, and they don't always feel good. So how do you talk to your kids as we're heading towards holiday season as well, of Thanksgiving and December holidays, of being around family who may or may not agree with you? And how do you navigate that? Giving your kids skill sets before you get into those conversations is a huge piece of this maintenance plan, because again, we want to build kindness and goodness and empathy and joy into your families. So it may be complex, but there's always a way to do that, even with differing of opinions.
Yeah. It makes me think a lot of like, how do you just have those conversations? So one that I hear all the time from families is they'll go to visit somebody and the 24-hour news channels are on in the background. And there's all sorts of stuff that gets shared there. And this goes also to the notion of it just monitoring what your child's exposed to, but being able to ask like, hey, can we set that to specific hours? Right. Or if you're a household that has it on, especially if you know your child has some stress and anxiety around this kind of content, can you identify and limit those things? And so maybe you don't have the 24-hour news channel on for a little while and you switch to only reading it on your phone in a very like monitored, focused way. So thinking about those kinds of dynamics is really helpful.
I love that.
Yeah.
And also talking to your kids, if you are going to visit family who have the TV on all the time, talking to your kids about which room of the house, if you either aren't comfortable having a conversation with that family member or they're not willing to change their habits, talking to your kids about spending more time in other rooms and you creating that boundary even without anything being changed in that other home, right? That can be part of how you help your kids learn to do things that are good for their own being when other people are not open to the flexibility that might support your family.
Yeah. So we've kind of walked into the what if kind of conversation. So we've walked through these 5 steps. There's definitely a lot of other things that can happen, right? And so there's this notion of what if they argue with you, right? What if they have different beliefs or they've heard different information or they want to challenge you and have a debate, which is kind of fun, right? So same as any situation, slow down and listen to their side, right? Show them how to have a productive discussion with disagreeing points. And it may not mean that your goal is to bring them over to your side. It may mean you're just working to understand each other, and you may call that out and literally say, hey, this is a point where like we have different beliefs or we have different information or right, like any number of things could be at play, but modeling how to have productive disagreement is your biggest opportunity here. What would you add?
So I would add that in those moments when our kids have something opposing to us, it's not actually about the content. It's about how you engage in that conversation. We so want to get to the agreement point of, but we're on the same side and I need them to understand if I tell them enough, they're just going to agree with me. But the truth is that's not how we actually change people's minds. So if your child actually is believing something different, you arguing with them and going in hot makes it more likely that they're not going to convert, because you end up like this. We all as humans want to be heard and seen and understood. So if you give them that grace, if you give them that space, does not mean you're agreeing with them. Listening to someone does not mean you're agreeing with them, but you give them their space to be heard. There may be something underneath their perspective that you can actually bond on. And then slowly over time, right, those multiple conversations will help them change their mind, or you at least come closer together. And so the best that you can to not react, but actually slowly respond and give them space, you will end up with a much better result, even though it can be more challenging. / that's also what you want to model for them to do out in the world, because that conflict is really, really hard on everyone when it happens.
Yeah. And I think that's very different than if they have incorrect information, if they have misinformation. So when they're developing different viewpoints, right? And you may still do some of the same steps together of like researching information and learning about a topic. But when there's incorrect information, and I have some resources on this. So if anyone is navigating this, happy to share. But in those cases, right, it's stepping back, understanding, it's almost going through the 5 steps again of gathering information to understand where are they hearing this? Is it a friend is repeating something they heard on a, social media or something? Where is the information coming from? And what are the trusted sources to look at to be able to understand what's actually going on there and help them break down the information? And another piece of it is helping them understand how to be appropriately critical and skeptical, like healthy skepticism of information when it gets shared. One of the favorite ones that I use all the time is there's one that goes around about there was nobody born on December 6th, 2006. And right. And it's like, it's so, and part of the reason why it gets shared is because it's like, it's birthdays. It's so fascinating. You're like, oh my gosh. Right. And incorrect information can very easily be like that exciting, like, oh my God, have you ever heard this? But if you stop and pause and you think about the actual statistical probability of that, and I've worked it out, it's like next to 0.000. I mean, it is so impossible given the number of people on the planet. But it takes breaking down that information to stop, to think about it, to be like, wait a second. And then in that case, you can actually work out the statistics of it. So
no, you can work out the statistics of it. Some of us just call you to work out the statistics. Let's just
happy to help.
Let's just know our lane.
So, but that's so this is a big, these what ifs of like, you get into the arguments, you get into developing viewpoints, you get into misinformation, you get into like we were talking about, even just you're at somebody else's house and there's differing opinions. And so modeling how to navigate, whether it's how do you navigate breaking down information and learning more, or how do you have productive disagreement, or even how do you disengage in a moment, are all really helpful things to show kids.
I love the idea of disengaging in a moment of if it is too hard to keep calm and have this conversation, if it's too hard for you to not blow your top, it is a great moment to model for your child to say, you know what, I need a break. I need to go get some water and get my thoughts collected so this can be a productive conversation. And that then shows them A, that they can, and B, how to do it for themselves later. And it's also probably a skill that we need to learn ourselves, because I know I still could practice that one. So amazing. Yes. Love that detail.
Yeah.
The other thing that I keep thinking about as you were talking was the idea that so many people are getting so much of their news off of social media. And as someone who grew up before social media existed, that feels really problematic. But part of it, and the critical thinking to me of it, is who are you following on social media, right? Is this, a random person who is an influencer who got famous for knowing how to do TikTok and is now creating opinions? Or is this a political science professional who has written papers and books and studied this their entire life, who happens to have a channel and is sharing their information there? And talking to your kids about the difference between that. And I know I'm kind of stepping into your lane, Dr. Carla, but like,
you're great.
Yeah, but it's not about just saying you learned it on social media. No, it's well, who on social media said it, and where did they get their information, and why are we trusting them? Are we trusting them because I feel like they're my best friend, even though I've never met them in person? Or am I trusting them because they have researched things and have access to information that they are now sharing with me? Those are very different things. And that discernment, not just around elections, but in general, is something helpful for your children to learn, because otherwise it's, they don't know what they don't know. So assuming that is really helpful, right? To help them differentiate.
Yeah.
And then,
Oh, I was going to say, we could spend hours pulling apart. There's so many different things to this. It is, I will happily talk about it all day, but that's why we're here. But yes, it's so interesting how you pull apart rhetoric and information and what gets passed along and what catches is fascinating. You were going to go on to another point. What were you going to add?
I was just going to add that this is the moment to potentially teach our kids that it is okay to disagree. I find that even with people who I am 90% aligned with, there's still that 10% that on things that we disagree. And I might even call us out, Dr. Carla, as we were putting these slides together, we hit a few sticky moments where I was like, I want to talk about this. And you're like, well, but how does this play out? And I was like, well, this is what I feel. And you're like, well, this is what I feel. And we had to take a deep breath and go, okay, well, what's our ultimate goal? What are we trying to do here? And then realign from that and find our way back to the beginning. So even when we agree, almost always, Dr. Carla and I, we don't disagree. But sometimes we're going to hit a moment where there's a disagreement, and having that not be the end of everything, having that not be an explosive, hurtful, mean argument, it being okay, and going back to step one and just taking a breath and going, okay, well, what's my goal in this conversation? What's my goal in this moment? And am I okay with you thinking that different thing? And in your family around politics, there may be some things that you're like, I have to figure out how to get them back on board with my view on this because it's really important to you. But there will always be nuances that they may think differently about, and that has to be okay. So find the way to make that disagreement okay, because that's how you come together. Dr. and Carla and I in that moment were like, you're wrong. I'm going to go do my own thing. And I'm going to go do my own thing. We wouldn't be here with you right now. Right.
And some of that's working through the sticking with the discomfort.
Yeah.
Right. Because it would be very easy to throw up your hands and just walk away versus, right.
Yeah.
Knowing when to take a breath and when to keep talking it through and work it out. And that's where the 5 steps come in so handy, which again, we're winding down here. So again, when you were thinking about any of these critical conversations, including talking about elections, right, that first piece is to breathe, to gather your own thoughts, your own composure so that you can show up for your kids. That second piece is to gather information with curiosity, with an openness to find out what they know, what they're thinking about, what they're exposed to, maybe how, age appropriate ways to explain things.
The third step is to assess their physical and mental health. It allows you to know exactly what steps of support is needed and how urgently it is. Step 4 is to create a plan and implement it. That means talking to your kids, but actually putting it in place, because our plans are only as good as the action steps we take.
And then the 5th piece is continuing to check in with them. And whether it's you go through the steps on a regular basis, you have something on the calendar, you have activities you do together, knowing that this isn't, our kids are living, growing human beings who are changing and adapting all the time. And so how do we continue to check in with them and support them? Yeah. So with that, a huge giant thank you for joining us. If there is anything either of us can do, our contact information, our websites are here. We are both available. Our goal is to get information out, to help people with frameworks. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Anything you'd add?
I would just say, if you found this information helpful, share it with a friend so that they can also find some tools and skills and perhaps some reinforcement that they're making good choices in how they are chatting with their kids about this election, but also just with critical conversations overall. And thank you, thank you, thank you.
Perfect. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.